Morning. It's a little cold here today, but there's still a lot of action on the front of the hive here. My name's Pete, and Cedar's just having a little break. And I thought we'd talk about condensation and ventilation in the flow hive. It's a little cold here today. Here it's a little bit cold. Still a lot of action on the front of the hive here. You can see, as you look in the window, Cedar's just having a little break. There's a lot of condensation visible up in the top super. There's a lot of different opinions about condensation in hives and how to manage it and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Condensation is formed when moisture-laden warm air comes in contact with a cold surface and is cooled, and the moisture then sits on that cold surface. It's probably more visible in a flow hive due to the windows, just because you can see it, rather than in a conventional hive. You can't really see it. So what you might want to do if you're seeing a lot of condensation is look at your ventilation options. So in the flow hive 2, there's a couple of different configurations in this bottom board. You've got your little door here, and we've got the tray. So the first position is completely open. Now you probably wouldn't do this in wintertime. You're probably more looking at this in summer. Up in here you've got a mesh plate that the bees can't get through, but allows a lot of ventilation in. Now, if you wanted to limit that much more, put your tray back in. And in this little door, we've got a bunch of vents here. So when those vents are in the uppermost position, the air can come in and get past the top of the tray and up into the hive. But if you want to limit your ventilation, switch that around, put the vents at the bottom, and that's actually, the vents are then blocked by this, the tray's little handle here. And that limits the ventilation option here. And that's how we're running it at the moment for winter. You may have seen in the window here, just as an aside, that there's a lot of burr comb that's been squashed up into the flow frame here. And that's just a way to try and coax the bees up to start working those empty flow frames. Because it's wintertime and this hive's not incredibly strong, we really want to try and get them up into the super. But if your hive in winter is showing a lot of condensation, you may want to think about reducing the hive to its minimum. So basically, if there's no honey in your super, you might want to take it off completely and put all the bees down into the bottom box. Obviously, if your hive is pumping and there's lots of bees up in the top, you're probably not going to see the condensation that you would otherwise. Another thing you can do is to make sure your hive is in the sun. Now this hive is in the shade for a lot of the day. These hives all face pretty much east. Optimally, you want to face your hive, if you're in the southern hemisphere, you want to face your hive north, so it's getting the sun in the entrance all day long. If you're in the northern hemisphere, of course, you want to face it south, so it's getting that sun across the hive all day long. If we go down to the end hive here, it's been in the sun for a couple of hours now. So the north, the sun's been coming in and hitting the side here of this hive. And if you see in the window, there's absolutely no condensation. The wall up enough that the water's not condensing. But if you come around to the shady side of the hive where the sun hasn't been hitting, you see a little bit of condensation in the window. So that can be a really good way to try and help the condensation in your hive, is to make sure that it gets a lot of sun all day. Of course, if it's summertime, you may want to think about shade in the hottest part of the day, maybe around 1 or 2 o'clock. You may want something that's shading it then. So, is there any questions, Trace?
Oh, there's a few coming in. There's actually a few. We've got a few locals. We've got someone from Nimbin, a friend of yours too, Pete.
Okay.
Sending you a thumbs up.
Cool.
But from Brunswick Heads, which is just up the road, asking, Charlie's asking, should he be concerned about the cockatoos around his flow hive?
The cockatoos?
Cockatoos.
No, I don't think so. I don't reckon cockatoos will disturb your bees. Maybe they'll make heaps of noise and wake them up. I don't know. But they don't eat bees to my knowledge. But it's great that they're there.
Absolutely. And Pete, Mish is asking, I don't know, do you know what it means when people say they have a cast from a swarm?
A cast from a swarm? So that would probably mean, I don't know exactly, but what I think it would mean is an after swarm. So when a hive sends out a swarm, or it could also mean that, because people talk about a beehive casting a swarm, so it's could just be the swarm that was cast from that hive. But it could also mean when a hive swarms, it sends out the main swarm with the old queen, but then a lot of new queens can hatch or have hatched, and that hive will send out one or several after swarms, which are much smaller, and they're separate swarms. So it could mean either of those things if you're getting a cast from a swarm. I've never really heard that terminology used that way, but a hive does cast a swarm or several swarms. One thing I should say, I forgot to say before about the ventilation option, I was only talking about the flow hive 2, and here we've got a classic bottom board. I was just going to talk about the ventilation options in the classic hives. So you've got a sort of a similar setup where you've got a screen on your bottom board which allows the air to enter, and if I take this core flute slider out, it allows for maximum ventilation. And as I said, you probably wouldn't want to do this in wintertime. If you put it into the top slot here, you can shut most of the ventilation down so that that's completely blocked off. If you put it into the bottom slot, it's going to make a slot for the ventilation to occur. Also, if you're experiencing a lot of condensation, you may want to look at a way where you will make a little gap in your inner cover at the top, and this will allow the airflow to come in the entrance and the back at the bottom, and then rise up and come out at the top. Because sometimes creating more airflow can really help the condensation issue. And I should say condensation can be an issue if your bees are getting wet, then that's definitely an issue. In the cold, the wet will actually kill the bees. If the hive is really wet inside in the summer, it's warm and moist, that can amplify your chances of getting fungal diseases such as chalk brood and sac brood. So I've got a skewer here, which I just ripped up into a couple of pieces. You can also use a matchstick or a stick that you find lying around. Just make sure it's really small and skinny so the bees can't get out. And what you do is just pop the roof, if I can do that, and it's a little bit, there we go. Just pop the roof and then prop up the inner cover in the front with your skewer or matchsticks. This one's already a little bit cracked, but I don't know if you can see that stone there. The bees have actually propellized that up, and they've propellized it every couple of inches or so. And that's a really good indicator. The bees will actually tell you what they need. So they've already had a gap there and they've propellized, but they haven't propellized the whole thing up. So that means that they actually do want a little bit of that airflow coming in. If they'd propellized the whole lot, then they don't want it. They'll also tell you that when you're looking at the screen in your bottom board, if you ever go to inspect, sometimes you can pull your brood box off and actually inspect the top of the screen, the metal screen, or sometimes the bees will propellize up those holes, some or all, and this will really tell you what they want in terms of the ventilation. But yeah, so if you've propped up, you're in a cover like this, you can then rest your lid, or your roof I should say, on top of the sticks, and that'll just allow for a little bit more ventilation and really help that condensation and airflow. This can also help with cooling as well. So on hot days, the way that bees cool their hive is they gather water. There's specialized water gathering bees, and they go back and forth to water, and they actually their wings on the baseboard, creating drafts of air that cool the hive like an evaporative air conditioner. And so if you've got the roof just popped up a tiny little bit, they can really help with that cyclic airflow. In hot weather, it's really normal to see a lot of bees out the front, hanging on the front of your hive. This is called bearding on the front. It's a lot of people when they go, oh no, my bees are swarming, what should I do? But actually, it's just their way of cooling the hive. If they've got a lot of bees in that hive, their bodies create a lot of warmth just naturally, so they'll exit the hive and hang outside, and that helps to keep the temperature down in the hive. Any other questions, Trace?
Yeah, they're rolling in now, Pete. Someone was a little bit concerned that you're right by the bees and they're not attacking you and getting stoned, getting stung.
These are really gentle bees, and I know I shouldn't hang in their flight path because sometimes they don't like it. And actually, a lot of the time, if you are standing out the front, the bees coming back, the nectar gatherers that come back, will see you and they'll go, hey, what's going on? And they'll just swirl around at the back of you because they're not sure what's happening to their entrance. So I don't know if that was happening, but yeah, like I said, these bees are nice and gentle today.
Yeah, they are, and I have to say too that Pete does do this a bit without his bee suit on, so that's right. And Stone, our photographer, I have to tell you all that he's dancing around the flowers in the garden, and I don't know how he doesn't fall. But anyway, hey, look, great question here coming from Helen. She's in Perth, Western Australia. Just wondering how much shade would be needed, because they're a bit worried about the temperature tolerance in the full sun for their bees in Perth.
Yeah, in Perth, so the summers can get really hot, I believe. If you're getting, so a beehive, the bees keep it around 34 or 35 degrees Celsius. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit. Someone can leave that in the comments. But anything over that, outside the hive, the bees are going to really struggle to keep their hive cool, and they're going to use a lot of energy. So stick up a bit of shade cloth on some posts, or move your hive, or I shouldn't say move it. When you situate your hive, you want to think about things like that. Like what you can do is get a cardboard box before you get your actual beehive. Get a cardboard box, stick it somewhere where you think is a good spot, and just watch it over a couple of days and see where the sun hits it and how long it's in the shade, and that way you really kind go through a couple of different places before you actually decide where to get your beehive. So yeah, in the hottest part of the day, it's definitely a great idea to shade your beehive. Something like that in winter time, it's good to have movable shade like shade cloth so you can just get rid of it when the days get colder.
Great. Marley, and just on that topic actually, Marley is just wondering what's the best practice for relocating your flow hive from one area to another on the same property?
Okay, so bees fly in a 5, 6, 7 kilometre radius, something like that. They're oriented to their hive. So if you want to move your hive over 7 or 8 kilometres away, then you can just pack them in at night when they're all at home. You just close the entrance. I like to use steel wool because it's breathable, so it still lets in the air. You can just chuck some steel wool in the entrance. So that's quite easy if you want to just a little way away. And then move them to their new location, and before you let them out, you want to disguise their entrance and make it so that when they come out they go, hey, it's all new here, and they'll reorient. So to do that you can put a bunch of leaves and branches and stuff across their entrance. It's a really easy way. I've seen cedar hang a t-shirt from the top here under the inner cover and roof down across the entrance, so the bees come out and wonder what's going on. As long as their entrance looks completely different, they'll actually reorient to their new location. But if it looks the same, what will happen is when they fly out in the morning from the new location, they'll automatically go back to the old location and hang there because they don't have a house, and then they'll die. You'll actually lose those bees, so you really don't want that to happen. So it's important to, before you let them out in the new location, just disguise their entrance.
Great. Ronald's asking, when they were inspecting their brood box, there was a bit of cross comb, so they did a bit of a clean up, but it left quite a lot of honey. Is it okay to just leave that there for the bees to help clean it up?
If it's inside the hive, yeah, definitely the bees will sort that out. When you have open honey anywhere inside the hive, the bees will go straight to it and start sucking it up with their tongues. If it's outside the hive, it's not really a great idea because it can start up what's called robbing, where if the bees are hungry and they find honey, open honey anywhere near, they'll just go into a feeding frenzy, and it can attract bees from a long way away, and it's actually a really easy way to spread disease. If there is any disease in that honey, those bees will take it to their own hives. But it can also, once the bees are in that robbing frenzy, they can then come at a weak hive with a lot of force because they're in that robbing frenzy and take away the weak hive's resources. So once that starts, it's kind of can be not so good. So you really don't want to leave open honey or honeycomb lying around your hive. It's a really good way to spread disease. But yeah, inside the hive, no problem at all. The bees will just clean that up. And it's their own honey, so they're eating it anyway.
Sherry's asking, if there's no sign of any brood or any sign of a queen, what should they do?
That's a really good question. If there's no brood or no queen, then basically your hive is doomed because there's no keep laying eggs and keep that hive ticking over and the population ticking over, and the hive will slowly die out as the individual bees get old and die. So you really want to track down a frame with eggs and open brood on it. If you've got, this is a really great example of why it's really good to start off with 2 hives rather than 1 hive, is because if that happens to 1 hive, you can pull resources from the other hive and give them straight to it. You can stick a frame with eggs and open brood into your queenless hive, and hopefully they'll make a new queen from that hive. From that frame of eggs and open brood. They make queens from larvae that have just hatched out of the egg. So on day 3, that's when they'll get that larvae and chew down the cell wall around it, and they'll make a bigger, chunkier cell to house that queen once she's pupated, because the queens are longer than the workers and drones. So another thing you can do if you want a quicker kind of solution is to buy in a queen. So source a mated queen from a queen breeder, preferably in your area, so that that queen's adapted to your conditions and you know that they'll thrive in your particular conditions. For instance, if you're a cold climate beekeeper and you get a queen that's adapted to warm climate, then you may find that she won't thrive in the cold climate. And you'll get her in a little cage. It's usually, it's usually full of candy in a tube, and then the cage is attached to the tube. You put that into your brood box, and as the bees eat through that candy, they'll get used to that queen's particular smell. It just takes a week or so, so you pop her in there in between the frames and just leave it for a week, and then check back in a week to see that the bees have accepted her. If they haven't, then you might be in trouble. You might want to try the egg method or buy in another queen. But those are the 2 things I would recommend to do for queenlessness.
Pete, Nicole's asking Florida, so it's pretty hot and humid, about 90. And the bees are all hanging on the outside, so they just want to know, is that kind of normal, or should they open up the roof and have a look? The trouble is that they get torrential rain most afternoons there.
Yeah, so that's an example of what I was talking about before. It's called bearding on the front of the hive, and it's in hot weather. It's a completely natural behaviour. As the bees, their own body heat inside the hive, if there's a lot of them, creates high temperature, and on a hot day they'll just move outside the hive to help the hive stay cool. So it's totally normal, and it's also normal for them to just hang while it rains. I've seen that plenty of times when the bees are just bearding on the front and it rains on them, they get wet. And I always thought that's not so good, but they seem to be fine and not bother about it, and they just go back in their hive at night, or else they stay. If it's a hot night, they'll stay outside at night. So yeah, it's nothing to worry about, but just keep an eye on it and see what happens. It's a really good way to learn about what's going on.
Peter from Coffs Harbour wants to know, can you use native bees in the hive, and do they make the same sort of honey?
No, the flow hive is just for European honeybees, so the yellow and black striped bees. The Australian native bees that people generally keep in their backyards in hives are really, really tiny. They're just a little bit bigger than one of those pinheads, those little plastic pinheads. They're really small. They do forage side by side out on the same flowers, and they don't bother each other. But they live they're hived in very small boxes, about yay big. And their honey is very different from the European honeybee. They make way less, and also their wax patterns are way different as well. They don't usually hang their wax, and you don't generally use removable frames for them. Some of them make spirals, and some of them make crazy moonscape looking wax. So yeah, flow hives just for European honeybees, and they make so much honey that it's possible to collect it all up in the flow frames.
Richard's asking, do we leave the flow super on all year round, or do you remove it during winter like a standard honey super?
Yeah, it's a good question. It definitely depends on your climate, and that's something you want to just talk to beekeepers in your local area about and what they generally do. around here, because it's subtropical climate, so it doesn't get very cold. So we tend to leave our supers on all year round because we can generally get a flow towards the end of winter and sometimes through winter. If you're in a cold climate, yes, you do want to remove your supers. And if you're in a cold climate and you leave your super on with honey inside for the bees to eat during winter, you want to take your queen excluder out, because the bees cluster to keep warm, so they stay in a big ball and they just move around eating their honey. That's how they access their food. They move around in the cluster and they heat that cluster. They actually disconnect the flight muscles from their wings, and they shiver their flight muscles, and that creates the heat. And they swap places in the cluster, so the outside bees go to the inside and vice versa, and the queen stays in the middle and keeps warm, and that cluster shifts around. And what can happen if can't stay in the cluster because she's limited by the excluder? So the queen actually gets left behind down below and she can die, or else the bees stay with her and can't access that honey up the top. So make sure your queen excluder's out if you're leaving your super on full of honey through the winter. Generally, if you are in a cold climate, a lot of honey for them to eat and get through the winter. As I said, around here we generally get forage for the bees most of the year, so we tend to just leave our supers on, but we don't harvest at this time at all, just to make sure the bees have got enough to eat.
Right, Pete. Michelle from Texas is wondering, they need to do a split, and just wondering that there's not a lot of room to expand it. How far away must they go to put the second hive?
Yeah, good question. That you can do a couple of different things. You can, when you do your split, first of all, in your parent hive, your old hive, make sure you find the queen so you know where she is. And then once you've split into your new box, you can choose then whether to put the old queen into your new box or leave her behind in your old box. You can put your new box, if you're splitting into what's called a nucleus colony, which is a smaller box, which is generally what you do. You'll take 3 or 4 frames of brood and eggs and put it in a smaller box. You can put it next door to your parent colony, and any forager bees that you've put into that split will then fly back to the parent colony, but the nurse bees, which are the ones who will stay, because they haven't been outside yet, so they don't know which box they live in from the outside perspective. The other thing you can do is actually swap the locations of the boxes. So you put your new colony in the same place that the parent colony was, and you put the parent colony next to where it used to be, if that makes sense. You just swap their locations basically, and any forager bees that are going from the parent colony are then flying straight back to the new colony because it's in the position that the parent colony was, and that will help bolster the numbers of the new colony. Hope all that makes sense, but basically you can just swap the positions of the hives once you've split, and that can help boost the new colonies' numbers.
Great, Pete. I think there's a couple of people wondering about, like, so if you've split a hive, both hives need queens. I think people aren't quite getting that. There's a few people saying that can a hive survive without a queen, basically?
Yeah, no, that's right. No,
yeah.
A hive can't survive without a queen. And if you're splitting, only 1 queen per hive. But if there's no queen in your hive, they're basically doomed. They don't really have a chance. So what happens when you split a hive is, as I just said before, you can choose to put your old queen into your new hive, and in your parent hive, with the resources they have, they can make a queen from that newly hatched egg, as I was just saying before. So from date of laying, emergence, a queen takes 16 days to chew her way out of the cell, and then it takes maybe 4 or 5 days for her exoskeleton to harden up, and then she'll fly out to mate, and she generally makes one mating flight and mates with somewhere up to 50 drones apparently, and then comes back and starts laying her eggs. So that whole process from her egg to her laying eggs is around 28 to 30 days. So in a month you'll have a new laying queen. So you really want to check back in your split or in your parent colony, depending on where your queen ended up. You really want to check for the new queen, whether you can see queen cells first of all in a week. See those queen cells chewed out. Sometimes you can spot the virgin queen, although she looks a lot like a worker bee. Although she still moves differently. She's very fast usually. But then, 30 days after you've split, you want to check and make sure you've got eggs in your split. Or you can see the queen. Generally when the queens have mated, their abdomen becomes pretty distended and they walk in a kind of stalking sort of way, different from the workers. That's a tip. That's the way that I kind of try and find them, because they just move differently. Their abdomen's longer. So I hope that helps. Hope that made sense.
Great, the stalking queen.
Yeah.
Pete, Bradley's wanting to know, he doesn't have any burr comb wax. Could he just buy a block of wax and use that for the flow frames to start them?
Yeah, you could, but I wouldn't recommend doing that, just because you never know what's in wax that you buy. And it's fine to buy wax if you're just going to use it in your house to make whatever, like beeswax wraps or candles or something like that. But if you're going to put it in your hive, it's probably not a great idea, because it can be contaminated with things like American foul brood spores or chemicals that have been used to treat, because you just never know where that wax comes from. So if you've got no burr comb, don't worry. It is a trick to get your bees up into the brand new flow frames, but they will eventually go up there. You just have to be patient and wait, and as soon as your flow hits and your bees have brood box, they will go up and start storing honey in the super, but it just can take a while, that's all.
Yep, being patient.
Yeah.
Patient beekeepers. Gavin's asking, this is a bit of a question, he's a newbie and was wondering, is it more optimal to put a nuke into an 8-frame brood box initially and then transfer it into 10 frames once it's nearly full? Or is it okay to just put the nuke straight into the 10-frame box from the beginning? Just a bit curious, just with this time of winter being cold and having a bit more space.
Yeah, good question. If it is in winter now for you, I would actually advise just keeping the nuke in the nuke box just for a couple more weeks, even a month and a half, just until spring hits, and then putting it straight into your 10-frame box. Putting it in an 8-frame box just depends what's happening with the forage in your area and how cold it actually is, but that would be my advice, just to keep it in the nuke. If you can't do that, if you're buying a nuke from somebody and they want to keep the nuke box and you're transferring straight away into your hive, yes, you could go straight into your 8-frame box. It's probably better than bumping straight to your 10-frame box, because with beekeeping, space management is really a key issue, and you don't want to give the bees too much space or too little space. So if you've got a 5-frame nuke, putting it into a 10-frame box when it's really cold and there's not much food, it's probably not such a great idea, and an 8-frame box would be better. But as I said, it just depends what's happening in your area at the time. But yeah, if it was me and if I could, I would just leave that nuke in the nuke box and then put it over when spring starts hitting in a month or so.
Great. Pete, if you do get your nuke and it's got foundation in it, and because the Flow Hive use the comb guides and have foundationless frames, does it matter to have a combination of the two?
No, it doesn't matter at all. It's totally up to you what you want to use, and you can use foundation if you want to in the Flow Hive, or you can just go for the naturally drawn comb. Your nuke. What you can do over months and months is actually slowly rotate your frames to the outside. So if you've got frames that have got brood from your nuke in the middle, what you can do is just grab one of them, plenty of forage coming in, but grab one of those frames that have got foundation and put them on the outside of the box. Once that brood's hatched out, the queen probably won't lay in that frame again because it's out on the edge. And bees usually will put honey and pollen on the outside frames because it's a really good insulator. It's got a lot of thermal mass, honey does. As I said, bees can break the rules a lot, but that's generally what can happen. And so then wedge, you can, and that brood's hatched out, you can then pull it out and replace it with a blank foundationless frame. And if you like, you can put this straight in the middle. Drawing that out straight away if it's in the middle. If it's create a space in the middle of their brood nest. I hope that made sense, but then you can over a year. And once you pull those frames out, you can then for candles and wax and all that stuff.
Nice.
Ah, actually I started about 5 or 6 hives, and so I can yeah, I think I helped him until I was in my early late teens, something like that, and then he sort of got out of it, and then my friend Cedar helped to get me back in.
Another keep the tray.
Really open. That the probably don't want to do that. Generally want to run your any beetle or mites. But yeah. Any more questions, Trace? Maybe last question.
Yeah,
Have you got
yeah. Like we're having a couple of freezing issues with our video actually. So one question is,
No, there's no on the ground. Cane toads here, which actually they get quite big. They'll eat the bees, so having them up a little higher can bending over quite, and it's